Dr. Christopher Ostrander. Welcome to Security Halt, man.
Glad to be here.
Dude, you're what you created is something that's absolutely necessary and utilized now more than ever. The ability to get a hold of one place and find all the resources that might be available to our SOF professionals is absolutely vital, and it's necessary. And today I want to figure out, how did you find yourself working in this community and helping so many individuals?
Yeah, whether you want to call it divine intervention or dumb luck, I think being a male in a pink collar profession, I had a huge part in it. So wrapped up grad school, and me and my wife moved to Wilmington, North Carolina.
Hmm.
And so, for those that aren't familiar, you're kind of triangulated between Bragg and Lejeune. Obviously, there's a lot of current and former SOF folks running around, and so yeah, just walked into the waiting room one day, and there happened to be a former Force Recon guy in there that had chosen my name, and so that was kind of the start of it. And then my brother-in-law, he's actually an E9 in the Marine Corps, so uh, knew enough about MARSOC and just special forces, and he was neighbors with a guy, and just knew, hey, you're not gonna hang a shingle and say, hey, this is the organization, or this is the group of people I want to work with, if you don't come from that
Yeah.
personal connection or background. And so it was awesome. I really enjoyed working with that person. It was a great connection. But then over the course of really the next 4 or 5 years, I kept running into, the wife would find me, and after a session or two, she'd do the sniff test, and then she'd be like, well, I think I can get him in. Or some guy was retired and he'd reach out, and so it just slowly kind of grew and grew and grew. By the time it was about 2018, I realized, okay, this is who I want to work with, and most of my caseload at that point was current and former SOF folks. So
Yeah.
it just kind of happened slowly.
Dude, let's take it way back, man. Let's jump in the way back machine and find out, like, what led you to even dive into this world of mental health. For a lot of us, I found myself wanting to study this after falling apart, after going through everything that a vast majority of our community and our GWAT veterans go through. And that's what made me, it's like, okay, if I'm going to, you know, lean into these modalities and find my way to getting back to the better version of me, I want to study this so I can help others. But I want to understand why you chose to go this route. What was the defining moment in your education where you're like, you know what, like, we need some more male representation in here?
Again, I think it was, for me personally, definitely divine intervention. Typical, and I think this is where I probably connect with people in the community. Like, I grew up in Wyoming. Played sports. My dad played college football. My brother played college football. My other
Wow.
brother rode bulls. So, like, very much like rub dirt on it, get over it, son.
Yeah.
That type of an upbringing, and we loved it. It was awesome, but there was always friction in different places, different relationships. And I think being the youngest, I was like super keen and kind of watching what was happening with the family dynamics. Being the youngest, less of a voice, and just kind of observing. My dad definitely had his some traumatic experiences on his end, so they were untreated. And so it was very much, you know, at times kind of walking on eggshells and figuring out, hey,
Yeah.
when's it okay, when's it not okay, those type of experiences. And so I was just focused on athletics, and similar to a lot of individuals that I've met from the SOF community. Yeah, I kind of had to burn my life down, and find that I needed help, and then through the course of that process, sought my own counseling, my own treatment. A story I like to joke around and tell my students, as well as even tell my clients, is the first time I ever went to therapy. It was during an intake, and after about 45 minutes, the clinician looked across the table and was like, do you think you could feel anything other than pissed off? And he slid a chart across the table, and it was, I was 21 years old. He slid a chart across the table, and I'm looking at an emotions chart, and I was like, I've never seen one, I guess. And that was just kind of a huge aha. Um, in and out of like substance use, different things. And then once things kind of organized in my life and I got things squared away, went back to school, was playing basketball. Again, not really focused on a career at that point. But then once that wrapped up, me and my wife had met. And then through heading to grad school, it kind of rolled out from there. And then I realized, like, okay, it's unique being a male. There's a lot to offer here, but again, I was really just focused on couples because me and my wife were going through education at the same time.
Oh, wow.
And we just really liked doing couples work. But the first client I ever had in grad school happened to be a young boy that had been raped. And so that was like jumping into the deep end on big T trauma. A lot of marital stuff, we talk about as counselor educators. Like there's big T trauma and then there's small T trauma, and it's a spectrum. And a lot of what happens is very similar. The consequences are very, very different. But so I was very familiar with small T trauma and even the components of large T trauma. But that was like the first, diving into the deep end. And from there, I was kind of hooked at that point.
Yeah. It's funny. You mentioned something that I hear and I experienced myself, seeing that emotions wheel the first time a counselor brings it up to you, and we realize that anger has become the only thing that we feel, the only thing that we know to be true. And I remember always telling myself, and a lot of us tend to say it, like, we're logical, we're not emotional. We don't have time for emotions. And we tend to think that emotions are this thing that we don't have to focus on. And then later on in life, as we're going through our challenges, as we're going through, maybe you find yourself going through mental health crisis, or you're transitioning, going into that civilian life, you find yourself having to come to terms with the idea and the understanding that, like, oh, wow, maybe I do need to understand my emotions. Maybe I can't just be this asshole that runs around like a tyrant in my house. Is this something that you've noticed with our demographic?
Yeah, so I think if I can take it outside of SOF real quick
Yeah.
and go on a 30,000-foot view. So both my grandfathers fought in World War II. If you go back and just look at what was happening in the world, you've got, quite literally Americans fighting for survival, whether it's the Great Depression or World War II. None of the research is caught up. And I would say psychology, some people may differ, but I would say psychology is still really young at that point compared to modern medicine. Fast forward to my parents' generation, they were raised by the greatest generation. And, it was hard work, take care of things, like don't get into debt, all of that. And then they raised us. And so, you're one generation removed from people that are quite literally just living to survive. And so on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food, water, and shelter are really high. Emotions, relationships are pretty low. Now, I'm assuming you're close to my age. How old are you, if I can ask?
I'm 40.
Okay, I'm a little bit older than you. But yeah, so relatively grew up the same period. Really, the research about the brain and emotions has really exploded probably in the last 20 years, I'll say. And so you've got psychology and the study of the mind, neuroscience really coming into maybe its adult phase as a field. And so we now just know how important all of that is. But as a culture, you've got this arc going on. But then also as males, like what are we taught in literature, in movies, is just that. Like you're either pissed off, which is acceptable, or you're happy because you're enjoying yourself. And, I don't remember reading a book growing up geared towards males or watching a movie that really talked about like the spectrum of emotions. Man, I lost the big game and whatever, high school football today, and I'm just feeling inadequate, Dad. Like that was never modeled to us. And then as a culture as well, this is the other piece that I think is really, really important to understand, coming from a sports background, military background. The idea of avoidance is really, really important, right? So when we think about avoidance in athletics, in academics, it's, hey, even though you're tired, you're hungry, your mind's someplace else, hey, compartmentalize that to perform this task. Hey, you don't feel good and you're on the treadmill. Well, sorry, dude, you got to keep going. You got another mile to go. And now we know the benefits of that, being able to compartmentalize and, focus on something, even though there's physical or emotional pain. We've taken that probably in our generation and umbrellaed that across all spectrums in life. When now we know, hey, that's really, really helpful in basic training. That's really, really helpful in the Q course. That's really, really helpful at BUDS and on deployment. But then when we come back, it's probably just as equally important to unzip and start processing that. And we just didn't get any of that information on the back end.
Yeah.
And so for SOF to come full circle, you guys, if that was the general culture in America for males, but you guys are 10x now, in that. And so, of course, you guys are going to be in a category and experiencing some of the things to a degree that, most of us haven't, just by the sheer nature of your job. But then you're going to take that idea of avoidance and take it to the next level as well.
Yeah. And it's also important to understand that the individuals that get attracted to this lifestyle often come from, backgrounds that aren't as pleasant as people tend to think. Individuals that come with a lot of baggage. So stacking more trauma on top of trauma makes for a very complex individual. And in my experience, when I was going through the worst, and some of my friends that had similar backgrounds, when they started to unravel, it made things very difficult, having to reconcile and kind of dissect the things that happened prior to the military and then everything that happened during your deployments and in the military. And in your experience, where's the best place to start? When somebody comes into your office, we often hear of, let's process and deal with one key moment. Let's work through that process. But when somebody has a lifetime filled with trauma, it's often what I hear is like, you want me to focus on one thing? You want me to focus on one thing to process? Like, I don't know, lady. I don't know how we can just focus on one.
It really, client-centered, client-led is a term we use in the counseling field. And so depending upon what's happening with that client, depending upon what they're most motivated to tackle, that would be something I would sit down with a client and assess, hey, what is it that you want to tackle? It's super overwhelming to have a career of 15, 20, 25 years of trauma experiences. And then on top of that, the childhood experiences that most likely teed you up to actually go in the community. I would argue those experiences made you more likely once you got in the military to find the community, because quite literally, going back to that avoidance and that ability to compartmentalize, you've been practicing that probably since childhood. And so I would argue that part of your brain is probably much further developed than the average human being that's walking into the military. And so if you have any athletic ability or any intellect, it's like a really easy step then into the SOF community, because you're going to excel really, really easily. But yeah, depending upon the client, I mean, it really depends on where you would like to go. And I think that piece and having that discussion is really important. One, for the assessment of what's happening, but two, you can't take a client, any client, let alone SOF, and say, "Oh, I recognize. Yep, you told me that you've got a negative childhood experience. Maybe you were abused, or maybe your mom died. Fill in the blank." You really need to address that. If nobody wants to address that, they're not going to let a stranger on a couch or across the screen push them in that direction. That would do damage to the therapeutic alliance, the trust in the room, and so on and so forth. But then taking one of y'all and saying the same thing, like, "Hey, Danny, we really need to talk about X," like that's even worse. And I think, unfortunately, I've heard stories of individuals in this community that have had that experience, which is part of the reason we exist, SOF Network, in the first place.
No, I feel like now more than ever, we've talked about it, we championed it, we promote the idea of being vulnerable, but it's still a difficult thing to try to discuss and try to, get that individual to make their way into an office. What do you think it's made you so successful in being able to build that rapport, to bring about that true vulnerability, to get that first? Because I know in my experience, everything that I was trying to say was always skirted or I sidestep just before the moment of like really truly being vulnerable, just because we tend to think that it's a weakness. And I mean, a year goes by and you're talking to the same P3 therapist over and over again. You're not really moving the needle. You're just doing enough to kind of like keep her at peace, to keep her happy. And have you had the same experience with individuals where it's just not, everything happens at their own pace, but do you find it difficult to get that true vulnerability with our guys?
I think it makes sense that some clinicians struggle with that. I think depending upon your awareness of what's happening in the room and picking up on the subtle cues and what they're telling you, what they're not telling you, should be an indicator. I'm a counselor educator, so this is something we talk about with our students all the time of you need to be really dialed into what's happening and the verbiage and the language, the body language of what's happening in the room, specifically when you start talking about trauma, because there are shifts and there is indicators of, once somebody gets rolling, whether they're kind of holding things back or not. And so I think if you're really attuned to that, you can kind of recognize that and then maybe have a conversation. For clinicians that don't or aren't maybe as aware, yeah, I think that they can definitely miss some opportunities. For you though, in your community, I would do the counselor thing and ask you, like, why is vulnerability such a struggle for you?
Yeah. Yeah.
And go ahead.
No, it definitely takes that, having somebody that's willing to give you that gentle prod, especially when you're dealing with guys that aren't comfortable and they're not used to just walking in and divulging so much. I know with there's a lot of programs out there that kind of provide there's always that fear that if I talk too much or I give too much, I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to lose my profession. And that's always the one thing the guys keep coming back is within peer-to-peer support, within being there from your friends, there's a little bit of vulnerability. There's a little bit of being that, finding that comfort and knowing that you're not going to divulge anything that I say. But we have to be able to kill the myth that it's going to lead to you losing your job. It's going to lead to you losing your livelihood, being on a team. Like, the ultimate goal is to be better, to get better, to be able to advance through what you're going through, to process it and move forward. So you can continue being that teammate, continue moving forward in your career, become that team sergeant, go on to become a sergeant major. But at times I feel, just even still talking to a lot of guys, there's still that idea that, like, man, if I get put on meds, if I get sent to a place, then I won't be able to carry out my career. Is that something that you still deal with, and having to tell guys and reassure them that, like, hey man, like, this is no different than going to the hospital or going to see a doctor for a physical injury?
Yeah, I've definitely seen that over the course of my career. And I think this is why cultural competency, specifically in the SOF community, is so important. You guys are no different than, I would say, professional athletes in the sense that your number one goal is to be deployable, right? You want to go on deployment. It's literally the whole reason, most likely, you got into SOF community. I mean, maybe the main reason, but one of the main reasons of why. And so, I can think back, just thinking of, for myself playing basketball, I would do anything, lie, cheat, and steal, take, whatever, a handful of ibuprofen that would, probably could take it three less and it would have been fine, but just to feel good enough to go play the next game. Because my overall goal was just playing. I just wanted to be on the team and go play. And so if you have that understanding, I think as a clinician, you sit down with somebody, in the community that's active duty, then you have to take with a grain of salt, okay, like the overall goal that Denny is coming is ultimately he wants to be deployable. So I can sit here and poke and prod and ask the right questions and hear all your mommy daddy issues or, do the counselor thing, but is that going to be the thing that serves Denny the best? Or is this more of like, hey, I can build strong rapport, potentially do a pit stop with Denny, show him that this is a safe place, let him dip his toe in the water and potentially get him back next week or the following week or a month when, he comes back from that qualification, and we can dive a little bit deeper. And I think as a clinician, you have to juggle all of that, because if you're not, and you're just, whoa, man, you've got a lot of trauma, like, hey, you've experienced a lot of that, we really need to unpack that. you're driving the agenda as opposed to recognizing what's most important to the client and letting him drive that. And so I think there's a feathering of the throttle and figuring out, okay, what's most important with this individual, figuring out how well do they really trust me in this moment. Can we even have a conversation of like, hey, there's this. At some point we need to circle back, or is that even going to potentially close the door? And how well can this session or this conversation serve this client? And if you're not having that conversation, I think internally you're wasting your time. One of the things that we talk about as counselor educators all the time is there's three people that typically walk into a therapy session. There's the customer. They come in, they're, money on the table. I'll do whatever you want. If you say jump off a bridge, I'll jump off a bridge for that homework. Like, I'll do anything to make whatever's going on stop. Then there's the visitor. The visitor's just kind of, hey, I'm window shopping, checking things out. Like, yeah, I'll tell you a little story. But then when you give them homework, or really when it's push come to shove, they're not putting money on the table. They don't really want to change, right? And then there's the complainant. This is the teenager that gets drug into therapy, the husband that gets drug into therapy. And so as a clinician, and I mainly specialize with couples. Yes, I deal with a lot of trauma, but in the scope of our network, I would say there's some excellent individual trauma therapists. I would say, hey, I'll probably stake my claim more as a couples expert, even though I do work in both worlds. But just because there's some amazing clinicians, I think that they're a few notches for sure ahead of me. But if you're not knowing who's walking in the door and then addressing them and the communication exactly which one, customer, complainant, visitor, then you're wasting your time. And so one of the things that I, over the course of my career, encounter a lot is like the wife is the customer or the husband's the customer and the other one's the complainant. And so I know, hey, I have one session, maybe two, to get them bought in. And so that changes things, right? So if the wife is the customer and the SF guy is the complainant, then most likely I'm going to do everything I can to build a therapeutic alliance with him, even at the result of looking like I'm taking his side, because I know she's bought in. I know I've got 4 or 5 sessions with her and I can burn some bridges. I can burn some collateral with her. But him, this could be the one time that I get an opportunity to really connect with him. And if I don't do it well and I don't do it right, maybe I push that guy off for another 5 or 10 years of getting help. And so understanding what's in the room and the dynamics in the room, it's critically important, because it determines what you're doing and what you're saying.
Yeah. That's often the issue that we have. It's the spouse finally gets fed up with us and the chaos that we bring home. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is that dynamic of, and I've seen it play out a lot, the service member perhaps gets sent to a treatment center, gets the opportunity to go somewhere to heal, to recover, to get tools. He's gone for, a week, couple weeks, a month, 2 months, comes back home. Now the spouse sees a better, happier, educated husband that is now trying to do the right thing, but there's this animosity. There's this, how dare you go off, get better, and I'm sitting here and I'm struggling. You brought all this chaos into the house for 10, 15, 20 years. You go off to this retreat, you go off to this treatment, you're feeling better, you've got all these tools. What about me? How do we support our spouse and get into an office like with you and be there for them and try to help them heal after all the things we put them through?
Yeah, I think there's several things that are going on here. One, I think, again, I'm a big picture guy. I think you have to understand what that experience is like for the spouse. They're married or, they're living with somebody who's not their primary allegiance. Your primary allegiance is your team and being deployable or yourself. Let's just be honest. The military is the other woman. She has priority. And the wife or, the live-in girlfriend, she's always second fiddle. And then to be the one that's banged up, and then all of a sudden you get to go to the fancy NICO, you get to go to the fancy inpatient facility, right? You get all the bells and whistles, you get to go up to, home base and work with the harbor docs, like, and all of a sudden magically you're better. That's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of spouses, rightfully so, because they're the ones that have been dealing with the worst version of you. And then oftentimes, the service member comes back and it's like, come on, babe, I'm better. And I think one of the things that individuals in that situation really need to understand is the spouse is always behind. So she's grieving behind you. She's constantly catching up with information. And then in a situation like that, I've seen this plenty of times in my own practice, you can be happy, healthy, and feel like you turned over a new leaf. And now she's experiencing that disconnect of like, great, we didn't even heal together. Great, he got all these fancy bells and whistles and some of the best docs, and I've got to figure this out on my own and take care of the kids and, make sure this marriage is still glued together. And, who wouldn't be bitter with that experience? That's tough. And so giving them the grace and enough runway to catch up emotionally, I think is really, really important. And, if this was a session, I think one of the things having that conversation with the service member is giving them tools to actually work with their wife, because she's now grieving this other thing that, once again, you got to go off and experience without her. And you're, again, emotionally in a different place. And so I think one of the things that I've seen over and over and over again in the community is the wife is constantly trying to catch up to where you're at emotionally. And that could be in the pits of hell, right? Because you're not disclosing what went bad and how bad it was on the last deployment. And so she's digging. And then maybe you give her a few pieces and then you're gone again. Well, now that information's fresh. She's just now grieving that for you and for her. But now you're on to something else. And so that catch up is constantly happening. And so I think it's really important in that situation then, and I'm repeating myself, but getting the service member some really effective communication tools to connect with her while she's catching up and not get frustrated with her of like, come on, I'm better. Like, we should be good now.
Yeah, it's very important to understand that, like, dude, you're going to go back home. It's your turn to be supportive. It's your turn to understand that you've got all these great tools to be there for your spouse. Be willing to go to therapy. Couples therapy is absolutely helpful. One of the things that's really, really helping a lot of people is stellate ganglion blocks. And there are so many resources to help you and your wife go to a treatment center together, get treated, and then also have talk therapy after stellate ganglion block. So if you're listening and have heard about that, here's another free shot. Reach out to Green Beret Foundation. They have helped a lot of couples get access to that and get follow-on therapy. In your experience, Doc, what are some other things that you've seen work alongside with traditional therapy?
I mean, the retreats are great. So sometimes that can really, dislodge a lot of things, whether it's with a couple, whether it's an individual, getting them outside of, their four walls or their town and just getting them away from their phone. So whether it's like Boulder Crest or, I don't want to start endorsing a bunch, but I just know a ton of them. Going and getting away can be highly helpful in a lot of different ways. Stellate ganglion block. I've had clients that use one and it's amazing. I've had clients that it took three, but then it was super helpful. Individuals that, hey, again, I'm not even going to push therapy. Just decide, hey, I'm going to go on a hunting trip or I'm going to go backpacking for a week and just go live under the stars and just reset. That can be highly therapeutic, just getting out in nature. Obviously, there's emerging treatment modalities, whether it's hyperbaric chamber, psychedelics. There's a lot that can be paired with therapy that is showing promising results at this point.
No. And let's take it into creating the SOF network. How did that idea come about?
Yeah, so that first client, going back to the beginning, we worked together, me and his girlfriend, him and I did some individual work, but then they moved. He was already retired. And so he just had a super unique set of presenting problems. even to this day, probably some of the most unique that I've worked through. And so he would reach out periodically. She would reach out. Hey, who do you suggest in this small area on the West Coast? And I would, look through Psych Today. That's we have, I don't know if you're familiar with Psych Today, but for the listeners, you can go on Psychology Today and there's a directory of clinicians and short bio, some of their qualifications, training, things like that, but nothing that I really felt like, yeah, this is going to be a fit. And he was a guy at the time that I knew if I paired him with the wrong person or said, hey, you really go check out this person, most likely, if it was a bad experience, that he may walk and not come back. And so that really agitated me just as a clinician and wanting to help. And so that experience kind of happened a few more times through the course of my career. And the more that I got involved with some of my clients, I would ask them, well, what about this? What about this? And so I was just learning along the way. And so by the time I wrapped up the PhD, I had just kind of seen enough of the barriers and the holes in the community to get help. And so I sat down and just kind of wrote out, hey, this is what I think would be helpful. And then I passed it around to a few people that I knew that worked within the community, and they're like, hey, it's a great idea. I think you should do this. And so, it was just seeing the problems, working the problems, struggling with TRICARE, which I think TRICARE is great in some instances for us as providers. It's for me, I can talk about myself. It's been more of a barrier than anything else, which is incredibly frustrating because they kind of hold the keys to the castle when it comes to working with active duty and even some cases retired folks. And so that's when I knew, okay, I can't fix TRICARE. I'm not going to get involved with military insurance. Like that's a fight for somebody that has much
somebody
more horsepower. Yeah. But what I found was, okay, finding providers that we can, go back to that first client, pass clients back and forth. And so at first, I really just wanted to find a network of clinicians that either came from SOF or like myself, I just kind of fell into working with the SOF community and really understood the presenting problems. And what I found was a ton of individuals, spouses and former operators that had gone back to school, gotten their degree and their license and were working. And nobody had kind of brought them together. And so as I was bringing them together and kind of calling the different nonprofits and saying, hey, here's what we're doing. If you'd like to use this, they came and said, wow, this is great. The reason we don't have our own providers is because of liability. Legally is what I've been told. And so if we endorse, let's say, the Green Beret Foundation, if we endorse, 50 clinicians and one of them makes a mistake, then potentially the whole nonprofit's up for litigation.
Oh, wow.
And so, and I heard that from several organizations. And so, not, just to be clear, the Green Beret Foundation did not tell me that. I was just using them as an example. And
we'll
so,
put a quick disclaimer there.
Yeah. So we kind of fell in this sweet spot where we're clinicians, we have our own insurance, and, okay, we all work autonomously. And so that's kind of where we fell into this awesome spot where they say, hey, if you can find the clinicians and vet the clinicians, we'll support our community. And then we'd find another community, whether it be, Special Forces Charitable Trust. Hey, we got all 18 series guys. And then, Operation Healing Forces, they're down here in Tampa with us, and they, do a lot of all SOF. And then just continued to kind of grow. And so we were just focused on, hey, how can we find as many providers as humanly possible? And that's really what started it all.
Yeah. And what providers specifically?
So currently any licensed clinical mental health clinician. So it could be actually a psychiatrist who's an MD that, works with psychopharmacology. The vast majority, I think we've got 2 or 3 that, one of them actually stood up, I'm going to blank on his last name, Paul. He stood up the West Coast NICO, but he's out in San Diego. We sit down and talk with them. Obviously, hey, do you know the community? Do you know the presenting problems? But then also, what's your approach? And how do you typically handle the doling out of medication? I think that's really important conversation, specifically with psychiatrists. But then when it comes to also say therapists as the entire umbrella. We're talking about licensed psychologists, licensed social workers, marriage and family counselors, marriage and family therapists, and then licensed counselors. At some point, we may broaden that and include PAs, surgeons, etc. But right now, we're just focused on clinical mental health.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because, like I said, I've talked with so many individuals that either contact me through social media or through the website, and they want to get help. They're retired, they're on the outside, so they don't have access to a P3 clinic. They don't have access to the same, vetted network, but they don't want to talk to a civilian anymore. They don't want to talk to somebody that's just on the outside that has no ties to the community. They find it really difficult. I felt completely comfortable talking to any doctor as long as I had a good rapport with them. But some people still have that feeling of like, if you're not part of this community, I don't want to divulge things to you. I think that part of it, there's a lot of myths that still need to get killed. Like the idea that if you divulge something from your deployment, that it's, classified, it has no bearing on your mental health. You don't have to worry about that stuff. But guys still deal with that. There's very much a group of people that still want to see individuals from the community or people that come from their area. They have a background understanding what we're like. So that's why I feel like it's super important to promote the SOF network, to be able to connect people with doctors and professionals that understand what you're going through, because they've seen us. They know our demographic. We're very different. And once again, how many providers do you have within the SOF network right now?
Currently, we have 85 clinicians. Probably by the end of the year, we might be closer to 90. There's a few people that are kind of onboarding, licensed in 46 states. And to your point, I think it's really important. So I'll just take it outside of SOF, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in psychology or just the therapy community, one of the things that we're really focused on just as a group is culture and cultural competency.
Yes.
And I think this is one of the things that people make a mistake. So ethically, there's an ethical issue here. So I'll just use an example of a past client. So this was a civilian couple. He was from Mexico. She was from the States. He was in the medical community, and they were having a child, or they had a child. And so as a clinician, as a counselor educator, this is something we talk about, and I actually use this case study quite often with my students. And I'm like, okay, so they come into you, whose culture is it? Right? You've got a Mexican culture, Mexican Catholic, she was evangelical, and you're mixing them together. And okay, well, which is it? And the reason that question is really, really important is because if you take the Mexican culture, well, then some of the enmeshment, meaning the family's very, very close, they're in each other's business, is a cultural dynamic. And so as an American, I very much could sit back and be like, hey, you need to draw boundaries, da, 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 da. And now I'm messing with maybe what's normal and healthy for that culture. And so that cultural awareness is really important. And so this whole idea of cultural competency, multiculturalism is really important when you start working with that individual. So now we can take that over to the SOF and say, well, why is that important? Well, I mean, just to speed up therapy, I've heard individuals say, hey, it took me 5-6 sessions just to educate my clinician on what my experiences were like in the SOF community. So, we're, by being able to find clinicians that either come from SOF or have a high cultural competency in SOF, is one, we've got at least some ability to understand some of the acronyms. You guys have way too many. But one, you can, hey, here's what my MOS was or whatever, and like not skip a beat. Additionally, when you come in, like we know the deployment tempo from the different communities, because a lot of the clinicians have worked in the different communities or worked adjacent with some of those communities or come from those communities. And so again, we're removing barriers, and we can get right down to brass tacks of like, hey, this is what's going on. Same thing, when I sit down with a couple, if they tell me, hey, I'm retiring from a tier 1 unit, and it's like, check, like I already know, you just say that, and I already know some of the stressors and experiences that have been going on for X amount of years. I don't need to know some of the details at this point. Maybe if it comes up and it's pertinent for therapy, we may discuss them, but just that sentence. Whereas, a typical clinician off the street, they may do great work, but the education and the time that it takes to catch them up to speed, I would argue it's going to take a lot longer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. The cultural competency from place to place differs, and that's why it's so important to be able to tap into online clinicians. That's one of the things that I realized, like, dude, guys get really comfortable and they build a rapport with a doc, but then they get orders to go back to brag, and it's like, fuck. I know I experienced that myself. You build you build rapport with somebody that's heard your worst days, and they provide you guidance and a way forward, and then you got to move out of the area. How's being able to be online helped you continue helping your client base? And have you felt any sort of difficulty dealing with just the online business? Because it is different being able to sit and hold space with somebody in person versus doing this.
Yeah, so I'll back up and go a little bit into my experience with that, but then also answer your question. So I was completely against online therapy for a long time, in person. In 2019, 18, me and my wife, through just different circumstances, were moving from Wilmington to Tampa. And so we were shutting down our private practice, and that was a bitter pill to swallow, because here, like I had mentioned before, the majority of my caseload were soft clinicians at the time, or excuse me, soft clients at the time, and I knew, okay, this is the people I want to work with, and I'm basically having to start all over. And I don't know anybody in Tampa. It's like, again, what are you going to do? Go hang your shingle and say, hey, I work with soft? Like, good luck. And then you're in a major metropolitan city, like, good luck. Again, divine intervention. The state of Florida lost my application. And I found out through the grapevine a year later that person was like a pissed off employee and like buried all the applications under their mattress or something. Anyways, it ended up being a blessing, because once we moved down here, all of my clients in North Carolina were like, one more session. I was like, all right, I'll get into the online therapy just to, get you a transition. And that was like in May. By fall, our license still hadn't come in. And I was like, all right, we're just going to do the online thing. And so that was a big transition. So that was fall 2019. Well, fast forward 3 months, 4 months, COVID hits, right? So the whole world goes online. We just happen to be online ahead of everybody in our community. And so we were able to help a lot of our friends that were like, hey, how do you do this? What do you do? All of that. I think one of the biggest hurdles that a lot of clinicians realize is, I think your skills have to be better. I don't have any research to back this up, but I would argue, I think your skills have to be sharper and more on point when you're online, because you've got to bridge this gap. That you're not in the room with me, Denny, right now, and I've got to do a really good job to make sure that you and I are staying connected, we're tracking, and that whatever we're addressing is we're meeting the goal of that session.
Yeah.
Where this actually is a benefit is everybody went online and realized, hey, we can do work online. And so fast forward, I'm not sure if this started, I think it started right before COVID, but COVID put it, just ramped it up. So the psychologist community specifically has already rolled out what they call the PsyPack. So if you're a licensed psychologist and your state participates in the PsyPack, you can apply for it, and it's a national license. So basically, you're licensed in 35 states to do telehealth work. You can't do in-person work, but you can do telehealth in 35 states. The Counseling Compact, I think, is up to like 25 or 26 states have passed legislation at state level, and we're just waiting for our national license to roll out. Same thing with social work, same thing with MFTs, Marriage and Family Therapists. So here shortly, the great thing about the telehealth, I would argue, is, we may have in the next couple of years anywhere from 150, or let's just say 100, 150 clinicians, but we're going to be able to cover all 50 states, probably 10x. And so the ability to jump online will reduce barriers. And I'll get back to a little bit more specificity. Going online has been probably one of the most impactful things at scheduling regular therapy with people in the soft community, because especially the active duty folks, it's like, hey, I'm out in the field today, I'm instructing. Yep, I can do it. And the wife can be at home with the kids. Whereas before, he had to have availability, she had to have had availability, and the kids had to have a sit. And not just an hour, right? Because depending upon where they're coming from, usually that's 3 hours, maybe, 45 minutes in, we're doing an hour session and then 45 minutes back out. That's a huge burden, every single week. And so now I've had clients that are in completely different locales, and we can still make sure things are regular. And so that's been extremely helpful. And I think it's going to continue to help the community, again, lower the barriers to therapy. And like you said, with your clinician, I'm assuming was probably down here in Florida, and then you got orders to go back to Bragg, is here shortly, that clinician will probably have a national license. And, if you wanted to, you could continue with that person.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the beauty of being online, being connected. I think it's the norm now. I think more people, if you're not comfortable with it, just give it a shot, give it a try. And it opens up your ability to see individuals from outside the area. I know that there are great counselors everywhere, but maybe you log in, check out Dr. Christopher Ostrander, and you have a great rapport with him. Now you can be his client, and you don't have to worry about being in the same location in Tampa. You can see him from Northwest Florida, or you can see him from Fort Bragg. Doc, thank you for being here today. Thank you for what you're doing. If people want to get a hold of you or they want to check out SOF Network, where can they go?
Yeah, so just it's SOF, sofnetwork.org. We built the website to make it super easy. So you can go into the clinical directory, and there's a couple different things you can do. You can click on that clinical directory tab, and you can just click clinical directory, and they're listed alphabetical, not state, but just alphabetical. And you can look at all the short bios of all 85 clinicians in there, or you can click by state. And so then it's, alphabetical state, and it's got all the clinicians in there. And when you click on their name, it's going to take you to their individual provider page. And so if you're in North Carolina, go look at all the different providers in North Carolina. Check out their page. On their page is their practice contact information. So if you want, you can reach out through the website and we'll get it. And then you can say, hey, tell us what state you're in, and if you want to use insurance, and or if you'd like some benevolent support. If that's the case, then it's really easy for me or whoever answers that email to jump on there and say, okay, you're in Oklahoma and you want to use insurance. Okay, well, that narrows down who you're going to work with. And maybe that provider, doesn't take insurance, but then we can follow up with, hey, we got you covered. But the other thing you can do is if you come from a specific community and you're like, hey, I'm connected with the Green Beret Foundation and I've asked for therapy, then great. Then they can reach out through us, or you can reach out and say, hey, I've got funding. Like, I just need a clinician. Awesome. That works as well. So really, it's ease of use. You don't have to talk to any of us. You can talk straight to the clinician and get on their schedule. If for some reason, they don't get back to you in a day or two, again, email us, just contact me, and it's just Chris at sofnetwork.org, or you can reach out through the website and say, hey, I reached out to, provider X and they hadn't responded, and I'll put you on an email together and they'll answer it.
Awesome. That is it's nice, short, and to the point. Don't have to jump through many hoops. That's what I like to see.
That's sorry, go ahead.
No, it's one of the things that I've realized with guys when they finally get to the point where like, all right, I'm going to reach for help. I've seen so many guys give up if it takes too long. If your website literally has too many like loops to jump through to friggin' get connected, they'll be like, oh, well, it's not worth it. Too many blockades. I'll give up. It's like, dude.
Yeah. Well, and this is something as a counselor educator, I talk to my students all the time. So as a counselor educator, I have a mandate. I have to answer all my emails within 36 hours, or else, I get somebody thumping my nose. What I've noticed in my business over the last 10 years is the same thing. Is counselors that respond and are responsive, you're just going to get more clients by the sheer nature of you're the first person. You'll hear that often, like, you're the first person to answer the email. And so one of the things that I know specifically about the first responder community, but also the SOF community and just the military in general, is it's a crime that you guys are trained and taught, like, move towards whatever with speed, right? I mean, like, move towards the problem with speed. And as a counselor educator, it's something I'm just pounding into my students' head is you should move towards your clients with speed when they first reach out. I think it's respectful. I think it's a professional thing to do. But most specifically in this community, when, like you said, they get out, that's half the battle. It's just they're used to working in teams, highly effective teams where people are moving quickly to solve the problem. And then they get out and they're told, hey, go wait in the line, or, go check in at your local VA. Not bashing all VAs. There's great friends that work at the VA, but there's hiccups there. And so we're trying to create an organization that moves as quickly or as close to as quickly as you guys move, because you guys deserve that and your families deserve that. And, as professionals, we should be demonstrating that type of communication and desire to work with y'all. And so this is something that I'm really passionate about. I can't control all the clinicians. Some of them are a little bit slow, but that's why I say, if they don't respond, email me. I'll light a fire underneath them, because I want you guys to get connected as soon as possible. And yes, I was just, actually last week, I was out hunting with my brother in Wyoming, and a guy reached out, and it was the same thing. I responded. And he was like, you're the first person who responded. This is so fast. And I'm just like, yeah, it should be. Like, you shouldn't be waiting. The fact that, it's 2024, about to be 2025, and we have people waiting a week to hear back from a professional, like, that's insane.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And that's why what you're doing matters. And it's a resource that needs to be celebrated and brought out to every trade show, conference, every event where we can get guys and gals from the community, whether it's active duty or veterans, because they need to realize that there are people out there that care. There are providers they can get in touch with at a moment's notice and start getting treatment today. Don't put it off. If you're listening and you're on the fence, just give it a try. It's just literally talking to another human being and processing through some of the stuff that you've gone through. And the hope is to understand it, to unpack it, and move forward so you can continue on your career, or continue on what you're doing in life as a better, well-adjusted individual. To everybody listening, thank you for tuning in. Doc, thank you for being here and for what you're doing, and we'll see you all next time. Till then, take care.